Alright, we're going to read Part 220, Railroad Communications. Subpart B, Radio and Wireless Communication Procedures. 220.21, Railroad Operating Rules, Railroad Communications Record Keeping. 220.223, Publication Railroad Information. 220.225. 220.25, Instruction, Operational Testing, and Employees. 220.27, Identification. 220.29, Statement of Letters and Numbers, Radio Communications. 220.31, Initiative Railroad Transmission. 220.33, Receiving a Railroad Transmission. 220.35, Ending of Railroad Transmission. 220.37, Testing Railroad Wireless Communication Equipment. 220.38, Communication Equipment Failure. 220.39, Continuous radio monitoring. 220.41, reserved. 220.43, railroad communication consistent with federal regulations, railroad operating rules. 220.45, railroad communication shall be complete. 220.47, emergency railroad transmission. 220.49, railroad communication used in shoving back and pushing movements. 225.51, railroad communication signal indication. 220.61, railroad transmission of mandatory directives. Alright, Subpart B, Radio and Wireless Communication Procedures, Railroad Operating Rules and Railroad Communication Record Keeping. The operating rules, each railroad with respect of the railroad radio communication shall conform to the requirements of this part. B, 30 days before the commencing of the use of the radio communications in connection with the railroad operations, each railroad shall retain one copy of the current operating rules with respect to radio communications as the location prescribed in paragraph B1 and B2 of this section. Each amendment to these operating rules shall be filed, and as such locations within 30 days after its being issued, the record shall be available to the representatives of the Federal Railroad Administration in normal business hours. Each railroad, each Class 1 railroad, each Class 2 railroad, each railroad providing intercity railroad passenger services, each of the railroad providing with the commuter services in the metropolitan and suburban areas shall retain in such rules as each of the division headquarters at its system headquarters. 2, each of the Class 2 3 railroads and any other railroad subject to this part, not subject to the paragraph B1 of this section, shall retain such rules at the system headquarters of the railroad. For this purpose, the section that the class terms Class 1 railroad and Class 2 railroads and Class 3 railroads have meaning given in the terms Title 49 CFR Part 1201. 220.23, publication of railroad information. Each railroad should designate whether the railroad base stations are installed with the wayside station may be contacted with the appropriate radio channels using these stations connection with the railroad operations by publishing them in the timetable. Special instructions of the publication shall indicate the periods during which the base and wayside radio stations are operational. 220.25, instructional operational testing employees. Each employee who a railroad authorized to use the railroad radio in connection with the railroad operation shall A, provided with a copy of the railroad operating rules governing with the use of the railroad communication in a railroad operation. B, instructed on the proper use of the railroad communication as part of the program instruction prescribed in 217.11 of this chapter, and periodically tested under the operational testing requirements of 217.9 of this chapter. 2027 identification. Except as provided by the paragraph C of this section, identification of each wayside base yard station shall include at least the following minimum elements stated in the order listed. None of the name of the railroad abbreviated with the name or the initial letters of the railroad may be used where the name of the initials are general usage of the understanding of the understood by the railroad industry, and name of the location, office, and other unique designations, except for as provided in paragraph C of this section. Identification of each of the mobile stations will consist of the following elements stated in order as listed. Name of the railroad and abbreviated name. Initial letters of the railroad may be used whether the name of the initial letters are in general usage and are understood by the railroad industry. Train name and number, if one has been assigned, and other appropriate unit designations where necessary with the word, locomotive of the motor car, and the unique identifier which indicates the listener to that precise mobile transmission station. C, if the positive identification achieved with a connection with the switching classification similar operation wholly within the yard, fixable and mobile, may use a short identification after the initial transmission. Actual acknowledgement consistent with the application of Federal Communications Commission regulations governing the station identification. 220, 22029, statement of letters and numbers in the radio communications is necessary for clarity. Phonetic alphabet shall be used to pronounce any letter used in the initial, except initial letters of the railroad. See the Appendix A for this chapter for the recommended phonetic alphabet. B, a word which needs to be spelled in clarity, such as the station name, shall be pronounced and then spelled, and if necessary, the word shall be spelled again using a phonetic alphabet. C. Numbers shall be spoken by a digit, except for the exact multiples of the hundreds of thousands may be tested as such. The decimal point shall be indicated with the words decimal, dot, or point. See appendix of the B of this part and recommended guide to the pronunciation of the numbers. 220.31, initiating the railroad transmission. Before the transmitting by the railroad, employee shall A, listen to ensure the channels of the which the employee intends to transmit is not already in use, identify the employer station in accordance with the requirements of Statute 220.27, verify the employee has made the railroad contact with the person of the station with whom the employee intends to communicate with the listing of the acknowledgement. If the station acknowledges the employee's transmission fails to identify itself properly, the employee shall require a proper identification before the proceeding with the transmission. 220.33, receiving a radio transmission. Upon receiving the radio call, an employee shall promptly acknowledge the call, identifying the employee's station in accordance with the requirements of the statute 220.27. Standing by the receiving the employee that need not to attend the radio during the time that would be interfere with the immediate duties relating to the safety of the railroad operations. B, an employee who receives the transmission shall repeat to the transmission party unless communication 1 relates to the yard switching operations. 2, the record message for any of the automatic alarm devices in general the nature of does not contain the information instruction in the device which could affect the safety of the railroad operation. All right, 220.35, ending of the railroad transmission. Ending a radio transmission. Except for the transmission relating to the yard switch operations at the close of each of the transmission to which the response is expected, the transmission employee shall say over to indicate the receiving the employee that the transmission has ended. Except for the transmission relating to the yard switching operations at the close of each of the transmission to which no response is expected, the transmitting employee shall state the employee's identification followed by the word out or to indicate with the receiving employee for the exchange of the transmission is completed. 220.37, testing radio and wireless communication equipment. Each radio and all primary redundant wireless communication equipment used under the statute 229 and 220.11 shall be tested as soon as practicable to ensure the equipment of the functions as intended to be prior to the commencement of the work assignment. B, the testing of the radio shall consist of an exchange of the voice of the transmission with any of the radio. The employee receiving the transmission shall advise the employee to conduct the test of the clarity of the transmission. 220.38, communication equipment. Any radio or wireless communication device found not in the function as intended for the testing pursuant to statute 220.37 shall be removed from the service of the dispatcher or other employee designated by the railroad shall be so notified as soon as practical. B, if the radio or wireless communication device fails in the controlling of locomotive en route, the train may continue until the next calendar date inspection, the nearest forward point where the radio or wireless communication device can be repaired or replaced. Statute 220.39, continuous railroad radio monitoring. Each radio used in the railroad operating shall be turned to the appropriate channel as designated in Statute 220.23, adjusted to receive the communication. 220.41, reserve. 220.43, railroad communications consistent with the federal regulations, railroad operating rules. Radio communication shall not be used in connection with the railroad operation in a manner that conflicts the requirements of this part of the Federal Communication Commission regulations of the railroad operating rules. The use of citizens and radios railroad operating purposes is prohibited. 220.45, radio communication shall be complete. Any railroad communication which is not fully understood and completed in accordance with the requirements of this part of the operating rules of the railroad should not be acted upon, which shall be treated as though not sent. 220.47, emergency radio transmission. Initial emergency radio transmission shall proceed with the word emergency repeated 3 times, and an emergency transmission shall have the priority over all the transmission, and the frequently channels shall be kept with the clear of the non-emergency traffic for the duration of the emergency communication. 220.48, 49. Radio communication used in shoving and pushing in movements. Shoving, backing, and pushing movements. When radio communication is used in connection with the shoving, backing, or pushing of the train or locomotive of the car or on-track equipment, the employee directing the movement shall specify the distance of the movement and the movement that shall stop on the one half of the remaining the distance unless additional instructions are received. The instructions are not understood. The movement shall be stopped immediately and may be not resumed until the understanding has been resolved, radio connection has been restored, and communication has been achieved. The hand signals other procedures in accordance with the operating rules of the railroad. All right, 22051, railroad communications and signal indications. No information may be given by the railroad to a train engine crew the position and aspects displayed on the fixed signal. However, a radio may be used in the train crew member to communicate with the information after the position aspect displayed on the fixed signal to the other members of the same crew, except as provided with the railroad operating rules. Railroad radio communications shall not be used to convey the instructions which would have to affect the overriding indication of the fixed signal. 22061, radio transmission mandatory directives. Each mandatory directive may be transmitted by the railroad only authorized by the railroad operating rules. The directive shall have been transmitted in accordance with the railroad operating rules and requirements of this part. B. The procedure of the transmission mandatory directive is as follows. 1. The train dispatcher operator shall call the addresses of the mandatory directive stated the intention of the transmitted the mandatory directives. 2. That before the mandatory directive is transmitted, the employee to receive the copy, the state of the employee's readiness and to receive the copy and employ the an employee operating the controls of the moving equipment shall not receive the copy. And copy mandatory directives. The mandatory directive shall not be transmitted to the employees moving the equipment. On moving equipment, if such directive cannot be received and copied without impairing safety operations of the equipment. 3. A mandatory directive shall be copied in writing and the receiving the employee in the format prescribed in the railroad's operating rules. 4. After the mandatory directive has been received and copied, it shall, after the verifying the accuracy, repeated with the mandatory directive, the train dispatcher operator shall then state the time, the date, the name of the employee designated by the railroad who is authorized to issue the mandatory directive. An employee copying the mandatory directive shall be an acknowledgement by the repeating of the time and the name of the employee as designated by the railroad. 5.1. For the train's crews before the mandatory directive is acted upon, the conductor and engineer shall each have the written copy of the mandatory directive, making sure that the mandatory directive is read and understood by all members of the crew that are responsible for the operating of the train. Mandatory directives which have been fulfilled and canceled shall be marked with an X in accordance with the railroad operating rules and retained with the duration of the train crew's work assignment. 2. For on the track equipment before the mandatory directive is acted upon, the employee responsible on the track safety shall have a written copy of the mandatory directive with an excerpt of the mandatory directive as an acknowledgement of all the employees who are responsible for the executing the mandatory directive. The employee responsible for the on-track safety shall retain the copy of the mandatory directive while in its effect. The mandatory directives which have not been completed, which does not comply with the requirements of the railroad operating rules of this part, may not be acted upon, shall be treated as though not sent. Information contained with the mandatory directives may not be acted upon by persons or other than those whom mandatory directives is addressed. And that was subpart. Once again, that was subpart B of part 220, radio communications, radio wireless communications.